The late preaching guru Fred Craddock used to quip, "Anyone who can't remember any farther back than his or her own birth is an orphan." He was speaking about the postmodern penchant for individuality and the concomitant lack of interest in history and context that tends to disconnect us and detach us from any corporate, collective, and contextual sense of the self. We're like orphans, isolated and independent, experiencing the world without family, without memory, without history, without perspective. His point is that we humans require context, historical perspective to know who we are. We're not sui generis creatures, isolated, insular, independent. We are contextual creatures, connected in a nexus of relationships that includes both the living and the dead. Lose the context, forget those connections, and we forget who we are and what we're about and why we're here and where we're going. When I was a boy, one of my favorite memories was spending time with my granny Stacy. She was already succumbing to the glaucoma that would eventually take her sight, but she turned it into a game that both entertained me and educated me about who I was. After dinner, she'd take out the photo album and have me leaf through its pages, reading the names and describing the scenes in the pictures. Uncle Buster, Granddaddy Stacy, Great-Granddaddy Costner, and so on. Then she'd tell me the stories behind the pictures, and slowly, inexorably, I would position myself in a nexus that was Stacy and learn who I was and what I was about. When in the morning my father would arrive to collect me, he'd always ask what we did, and I'd tell him that we played Stacy. And he'd say, "I remember that game." I had a similar experience recently at a little church where I was doing a Bible study. Beautiful little church set out in the country. The forefathers and foremothers of the faith, though poor farmers mostly, thought it important to place stained glass windows in the sanctuary depicting events and persons of their biblical and communal heritage. It was interesting in that the windows mixed scenes, both from the ancient biblical story and from their own congregational story, with the result that you were surrounded by the story, reaching all the way back to Abraham and Moses and Jesus and all the way forward to today. The effect on the worshiper was unmistakable. You were positioned in a nexus of relationships and values and events that began long before you arrived and would, God willing, continue long after you departed. It was impossible in such a setting to feel orphaned when, as the writer of Hebrews put it, you were surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. The implications for church are far-reaching and broadly applicable, but nowhere more critical than in the way contemporary Christians handle the scriptures. The proliferation of translations and designer study Bibles has led many Christians to think of the Bible exclusively as my book. The only question many contemporary Christians ask of the Bible is, what does it mean to me? As though what it means to me is what it means. But the Bible was the Word of God to somebody else before it was the Word of God to you. We do well not to forget that. Like those Christians in that little church surrounded by a corporate, ecclesiastical, and biblical context, we do well to remember that the Bible is a shared book in which we are engaged in timeless conversations with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Jesus, and Paul. Now, don't get me wrong, what does it mean to me is a valid and appropriate question, but only after we've spent some time leafing through the family album we call the Bible and consequently have located ourselves in the story. To do otherwise is to be a spiritual orphan. Till next time, take care. God bless.